Hello there, I'm Susan Smith, and welcome to my studio, Stitched by Susan. So glad you're here this afternoon to spend, hopefully, some of the afternoon with me. I'm working on an edge-to-edge project this afternoon, and if you've been here before, you know I usually do a project absolutely from start to finish, loading all the way through unloading. Um, and if you're new here today, well, maybe I should introduce that a little bit first and say kind of what the purpose of these episodes is. I try to do a couple of these live episodes every other week, and they can always be found on my Facebook page here. And we also upload them to YouTube afterwards. So whichever platform you prefer watching them on, you can always come back and watch the replays. But kind of my purpose for doing it is because I feel like we learn well by watching others. I think from infancy, we all learned that way, right? We learned by watching our parents talk or handle their spoon or walk and all those sorts of things. When it comes to long arm quilting, that's not as easy because we don't usually quilt on a long arm with anyone else. We can't take our machines to each other's houses easily, right? So it's kind of a solitary thing, and it's more difficult to learn just some of the very basic things because you never see anyone else doing them. So with these episodes, my goal is to just show you in real time and real life exactly the process that I use in quilting a quilt. So whether it's loading it or basting it or even having thread breakages and problems, none of that gets edited out. It's all in exactly as it happens. So it just kind of gives you the ability to look over a quilter's shoulder and see how I do it. And I don't profess to know everything or do everything the right way. I'm open to learn too, but this is how I do it. And throughout the process, I chat and often talk about the reasons that I've chosen a design or chosen a thread or chosen to baste this way or whatever. So I'll give you my reasons for what I do. And I'm so glad if you're interactive and post comments on what I say, ask questions. If there's anything you wonder about what I'm doing or things that puzzle you in your quilting, by all means, chime in. Let me know what the questions are. If you preface them with the capital Q, they'll be more visible to our eyes on the screen. My husband is behind the scenes. He's got a couple of monitors and several cameras and all the stuff going on, and he's keeping all those balls juggled smoothly, more or less. So this is live, however, so be aware, if we have mic problems or if there's traffic sounds, that's just the reality. So this is a live and unedited show. So if you were here yesterday, I said that I was going to do, I think I said this, that I was going to do an all over feather design today. And I am going to do that, but I had to make some decisions. I had not yet unfolded the quilt that I had designated for today. And when I started unfolding it, I realized that it's a ginormous quilt. So I had to make some adjustments. So I opted to go ahead and load it. If you want more information on my loading process, yesterday, March 3rd was yesterday? I think so. March 4th, Thursday's episode, I talked quite a bit about the loading process as I did it. So you can always run back and check that one out. So for today, I've got it preloaded. I'm going to quilt and as always, chat as I go. And we'll kind of see how the afternoon goes. If my neck and shoulders can stand it, I'm just going to keep quilting till it's done. You can come in and out of the room. Like certainly it's not riveting. You don't have to watch every bit of it. It's a bit like watching grass grow after a while. But, if you've got it on in the background, you can sometimes just glean something from seeing how I deal with the project. And this is a particularly large project. So that may be helpful to you. If you know of friends who you think might be interested in this style of quilting too, please feel free to share. So kind of lower right-hand side of your screen, there's a little whoosh. Oh, my husband says, no, you're wrong, lower left. I'm pretty sure on my screen it's lower right. Anyway, there's a little swooshy arrow with share. You're welcome to share this in your feed, and then your quilty friends will see it and hopefully will come along too. It's kind of like a quilting bee. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I've loaded the backing, which is a solid white. I've loaded my Hobbs 80/20 batting and my quilt top. And Dave, you're looking at me like you have a question. What's it all about? Okay, Dave and I are just conferring a wee bit. So I think I'm ready to quilt. I'm going to quilt with a just off white thread. It's not even eggshell. It's just off white. I use the Isacord brand. It's 100% poly, 40 weight thread, but don't let that fool you. It's actually pretty fine. And it is my favorite thread, and I've got the same thread in both the top and the bottom. So I am loaded and ready to start quilting. So we'll just do our best today, and we'll kind of play this a little bit by ear because the quilt is so incredibly huge, and we tried to adjust the cameras so that you can get a pretty good bird's eye view of the whole thing. We'll just do the best that we can. The design that I'm quilting, as I said, is the all-over feather. And this is not intended to be particularly instructional. You can certainly watch as I do it, but we don't have a lot of close-up cameras on the quilting. If you want to know more about quilting this design, I'm hosting a webinar tomorrow. And the first one is at 9 a.m. Pacific time, tomorrow morning. Free to attend. There's a link on my website in order to join up for that on my social media too, on Instagram and also on Facebook. So that's a free class webinar, and I will break down this design into tiny little increments and show you how to draw it and show you how to move around the quilt. But for today's purposes, you're just going to get to observe me doing the whole thing, and whatever you can glean from that, be my guest. So let's baste. My top is floating, so I am dealing with my quilt is kind of tossed under my long arm. And as a little side note, I do make a real effort to keep my floor nice and clean so that I can safely have a client's batting and quilt. Oh, we're running to the limit of our cord. What are we going to do, Dave? Hang on a second while we make an adjustment here. Right to the front here. Okay, that's it. These are the lovely perils of doing these things live and doing it with such enormous equipment, right? If you have a long arm, you kind of get it. I have a 12-foot frame. I'm quilting on a Gamel. Let me see. Well, it was a Vision, but it's been upgraded to the Elevate. But I have a 26-inch throat, so it's quite a large machine. So this is always our challenge with filming, is to get everything in the picture for you, hopefully close enough that you can see it, and yet far enough away so that you can see the whole process, which is what I'm trying to show here today. I would love to hear where you're watching from. I'd love to hear what kind of quilting you do, even what kind of machine you have. Do you quilt just for yourself or for clients? Do you quilt detail? Love freehand edge to edge too. I should have put my channel lock on. I will for the top. So my machine has these nifty magnetic channel locks, which prevent my sewing head from moving. So now I've got my horizontal one on, so I can't move forward and back. So I will get a lovely straight line across the top of my quilt. And I'm pulling my machine with my right hand, and my left hand is always guiding the fabric. I'm making minute adjustments up and down all the time to keep it straight with my line of stitching. If you're not confident doing that, by all means take the time to pin this a little beforehand. Better to take the time to pin than to be unhappy with the crooked edge, or worse yet, to have to undo stitches. So, and in particular, I put a little bit of pressure on the fabric behind where I've already stitched. That keeps any excess fabric from pushing out in front of my hopper foot. So I'm just using that little bit of pressure on the part that's already stitched. You could certainly baste this with a much larger stitch. I just don't find that that saves me time, so I just don't bother changing the stitch size. But that's just my personal preference. And now I have my vertical channel lock on, so I'll get a nice straight line, and I'm just making an adjustment. I can feel that the backing seam is twisted under there, so I'm just quickly adjusting that. Again, putting a wee bit of tension on the fabric that's already been stitched. And this is where some of you laugh at me. I always start quilting from the top right-hand corner. And the only reason I do it is because I end my basting on this right-hand side. And so it saves me from breaking thread. But there is no reason to do that. If you prefer to start from the left, be my guest. I would usually at this point put magnets all the way across the front of the quilt because it is floating. That keeps the front smooth and it cannot pull up any excess into the area that I'm quilting. However, with this particular quilt, because it's so large and so heavy, I will not need to do that for the first few passes. There's plenty of weight holding it down smooth. I've used the red snapper system both to attach the backing to my rails top and bottom, and also these side stretchers are part of their system. And seriously, this quilt is so big, I can hardly reach around it. Someone did show me a trick the other day. I'm not sure if you're seeing this on the camera, but these new, the new variety of red snapper stretchers have a very slim channel for the fabric to go into, but it works pretty well to use your pins, the tip of your pin, to just kind of smoosh it in there. When you guys get to seeing that end of my machine, you'll laugh at my little stretchy bit on that clamp that, well, you'll see when. Let's just make sure my quilt is down nice and flat so we don't get bouncing going on. I raise or lower my quilt frequently so that I don't get bouncing happening here. Okay, we are launching into our freehand feather. Here we go. Oh, first I got to take the channel lock off. And really simply, this is just a spineless feather. In its very simplest terms. Everything beyond that is bells and whistles. So as I said, feel free to type in any questions that you have, whether it's about the thread or the basting or the type of batting I'm using or the quilting itself, whatever you like. I am unashamedly an advocate for all over quilting. I think that it adds so much texture and beauty to quilts while keeping the quilting costs for those who are paying very economical because it keeps the time way down. And certainly I looked at this quilt and it would be beautiful with custom quilting. You'll see as we advance. There's lots of white areas that would be absolutely gorgeous with custom quilting. But this is a project for a client and it is a gift quilt to a, I don't know if fire station is the right word, or a firefighting zone. And so the goal is not necessarily to have the fussiest quilt, right? The goal is to be able to give as many quilts and comfort as possible. So to my mind, this is a perfect time for using edge-to-edge quilting. And I especially love the all-over feather because it's a feather. Who doesn't love it? And also because when you wash quilts that have this design, they crinkle into the loveliest texture. Chiefly, I think, because it's such evenness of coverage. You know, each of the plumes are similar in size. You don't have any large unquilted areas or tightly quilted areas. It's just a nice, even coverage. I'm just going to take a moment here. Something else that I talk about a fair bit in my quilting is when I do quilt edge to edge, it is always preferable. What's happening, Dave? Oh, we might have to change the mic out. It's giving us trouble here. Tell me when. Checking. 1, 2, 3. How are we working now? Better? Okay. So as I was starting to say, my preference when I'm quilting edge to edge like this is to use non-regulated stitching. I find it smoother. I find the sound of the machine more soothing and not as tiring. And I just find that I make smoother shapes. So that's what I'm going to do for a while, because this is a pretty mindless quilting design, honestly. So if you have not used the non-regulated before, what it does is the needle moves at a fixed rate. And it's up to me, the quilter, to decide how fast I move the head, and that determines the length of the stitches. So it's really helpful if you want to practice getting smoother in your quilting, because you're forced to. Otherwise you get very long or very small stitches. Very irregular ones anyways. I'm going to pause for a second, and I'm going to speed it up a little. That's just a little slow for me to be comfortable. There we go. A little better. So I play around with that speed a little bit. If it's too fast, you'll feel just a little bit rushed, like someone's just a little bit hurrying you along. And that's not a good feeling, because that's not relaxing either. And if you're a little too slow, as I was a moment ago, I keep kind of outstripping it and getting these long jumps of stitches. So there's a sweet spot in there. And if you're curious, I'm running at 60% right now. I'm not sure how that relates between brands of machine, but on my Gamel, that's a comfort zone for me for sure. When I have the stitch regulator on, I usually do my edge-to-edge designs at 12 or 13 stitches per inch. So that's kind of my goal for the appearance of this, to be similar. This really does work wonders for smoothing out your quilting, because you kind of have to focus then on not stopping long time in the corners, you know, or you'll get 40 stitches in a 1/4 inch. And just on your speed, really smoothing out. So this is great practice. If you haven't done it before, I encourage you to try it. It just smooths out your quilting altogether. It is a little startling if you haven't done it before, so start a little slower. Get used to it. It's like being a brand new driver. Takes a little getting used to. One nice thing about this white fabric is you're getting a really good look at the shape of the design. It sometimes doesn't show up quite this much on printed fabrics. Today's marathon session is probably a great time to talk about relaxing at the wheel of the quilting machine. I'm not sure who first mentioned to me, a fellow quilter, that you should be able to open and close your fingers on the handlebars of your machine at any given time when you're quilting. And I find that to be a good judge for me. And I just do that from time to time as I'm quilting, because it's all too easy to start, clenching a little bit on the handlebars. And that's not a good way to quilt. Your machine does not need very much pressure or influence to move in any direction. So it's really not necessary to clench on the handlebars. All it is fatiguing. And so really concentrate, when you're not concentrating on everything else, on relaxing your fingers. It just takes the very lightest of pressure. I'm using a big and heavy machine, and still, it just takes the very lightest of pressure to move the machine around. My machine, by the way, is named Lucy. I know you can't see it on camera, but I have an I Love Lucy sign hung right above my machine. A dear friend gave me that, and it's very apropos. And I actually realized yesterday I'm watching lots of people, because it's March and National Quilting Month, and also the month that I think it's Amy's Creative Side hosts the IG Quilt Fest on Instagram. And so I'm watching all these people posting all their, memorable moments from this and that. And so it's causing me to kind of cast my mind back over things. And I realized that last week, actually, was Lucy's birthday. So when I say birthday, it's kind of a misnomer, because this particular machine is my second one. But February 25th is the anniversary or birthday of when I acquired my first long arm and fell in love with this process. So that was 6 years ago and a little bit. So happy birthday, Lucy. Even if it wasn't exactly you, we'll let you blow out the candles anyway. When I get to the end of this pass, I'll pause for a few minutes while I'm advancing the quilt and so forth, and answer any of your questions that you have. Read some of the comments about people that are watching, where you're watching from, those sorts of things. If you've just joined and possibly didn't hear me say earlier, this all-over feather design today is not particularly instructional about how to do it. I'm just letting you sort of watch over my shoulder. But tomorrow I am hosting a webinar on YouTube, and it is free, but it is all about this all-over feather design, breaking it down into, the little individual motifs, how I move across a quilt top, how I deal with awkward corners and traveling, all that kind of stuff. So there's going to be one of those tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific time, and then I'll be doing another one, same content, but again live, Sunday afternoon at 4. So you're welcome to join in either or both of those. You're welcome to bring your questions, and I will try and address them. But if you're here today, it's a great time to ask questions too. Only don't make them too complex, because I've got to hold my tongue just right to keep this going, right? That's what my mom used to always say. You got to hold your tongue just right or it doesn't work. What I'm going to try to do is just roll the quilt ahead a couple of inches and then do a whole nother pass back to the other side before I have to sort of unlatch everything and roll it further and do more basting. I think that should do it. Just need to raise it a little bit. Make sure everything's smooth. Do we have any questions, Dave, we want to address or chat with anyone about where they're chiming in from? Oh, here's our poll. I love polls.
Oh, I don't have the poll up yet. Hold on.
Oh, okay. Don't worry about it. We can go on to questions.
Yeah.
Questions. How? And this is Deanna, I think. It's hard to read from across the room on a little screen. How do you balance light with the thread color, fabric color, machine lighting, and room lighting? I'm struggling to see stitches when the color of the thread fabric is similar. So do you mean you're struggling to see it today, or you're trying to do some filming and you're struggling to see? So I'll kind of wait for you to clarify that if you would. Oh, Dave made the typing bigger. How nice. Okay. Becky, I think. Now the name is kind of hidden behind black areas of my screen, so forgive me if I get your name all wrong. Question. When you started, how long did it take you to get this smooth doing feathers? Did you start by drawing them out first or just practiced quilting them? Pretty sure I drew them out. But if you come to the webinar tomorrow, I will show a picture of the first all-over feather that I did, and it did look quite a bit different from this. Not because it was wildly wobbly, but because I didn't have nearly as good a method for moving around the quilt. So that has evolved very much. I don't know that I started with an all-over feather either. I started by quilting feathers in finite bordered places because that was easier to fit them in. So this is a bit of a process. It's increasingly sort of complex. And if you've quilted, I'm sure you realize it's not all that easy sort of spatially to move across a quilt with the feathers, but I've got some great pointers for that in the webinar. Okay, I mean when I'm sewing, I'm having problems seeing it. Well, certain times of day are certainly better than others. Certain types of light bulbs are better than others. And machines often will have different styles of lighting. So on my machine, for example, right now on camera, I have no overhead light on my quilting because that shows up best on camera. Or I can have a little LED light on, or I can have black light. And not everyone has the black light option. But you might play with your bulbs, whether they're a little whiter or a little yellower, or daylight light bulbs. I would just play with those things, but sometimes having less light is easier because it almost creates shadows, and I sometimes find that a little easier to see than having something incredibly but evenly lit. So give it a try, experiment with it. Linda, this has become my favorite meander. I've experimented with doodling a molar tooth meander after watching your tutorial. Okay, so the feather, but with the molar tooth style of plume, I guess is what you're saying. And yes, that works very well too. That's a great way to personalize it. Great idea. Okay. Any more? Becky again, love watching quilt, especially all over feather. It is mesmerizing, isn't it? There is something quite relaxing about edge-to-edge quilting. Do love doing it. And Michelle, hello from Texas. Just currently got a Knolting Fun Quilter on Hinterberg frame. Computer system, but does have stitch regulator. Never used a long arm before, so a definite learning curve. Still practicing to figure out what I'm doing. Yes, and there's the two things that you're learning. One is the quilting, and the other is your machine. Because every machine is a little bit different from every other, but you'll find you'll get to know your machine very well. My best advice is just don't be scared of it. Dive in and do it. The more you do it, the faster you'll learn. Is that all of them for now? Watching from Calgary, Alberta. Yay! Okay, you may or may not be able to tell from my voice, eh? I'm a Canadian. So, I know right where Calgary is. I grew up actually north of there, in northern BC. From Riverside, California, Amanda. And Amanda, got my Millie last December. Quilt for myself and the quilts I make to gift to family. No computer. Prefer ruler and freehand. Still a beginner. Haven't kept up my practicing. Well, you know, there's no law that says you have to practice a certain amount. On my current machine, I should be quilting as I talk now. My current machine does have a computer, so I do have the option of doing digitized designs. Hang on one sec. Dave's wanting me to do the poll before I dive into quilting again. Coffee, tea, or water? That reminds me, Dave, where's the coffee? Let's see. Coffee 50%, yay, team coffee. Tea 8%, water 33%. Can I add anything into my coffee? 8%. Yes. There are certain times of day and certain quilts when that is really advantageous. Yep. I'm a coffee girl myself. I'm trying to learn to be more of a water girl. So, yeah. Okay, back to computers. The first one that I had did not have any computerization options. All it had was the channel locks that I was telling you about. And I love that machine. That's the style of quilting that I love doing. And so I did, I don't know, 750 quilts or thereabouts on that machine. And this one is a recent upgrade, and by recent I mean maybe 4 months ago. So I do now have a tablet, which is kind of a lower end computerized type of machine. And I did that because I would really like to start converting some of my freehand work into digitized pantograph designs that I could then make available to other quilters. So that was kind of my goal for it. Not so much that I want to use a computer in my work, but I want it accessible to be able to produce patterns. So that's my thought process there. My personal feeling is that freehand quilting is so fast. So if I'm doing edge-to-edge work, I am pretty confident I can turn out a quilt more quickly. Like when you include everything, right from loading to, you know, advancing to not having to line up repeats and things like that. I'm convinced I can do a quilt faster freehand than the computer can do it. Of course, the advantage with the computer is you can walk away and do something else, and I do understand that advantage for sure. But the computer, at least on my machine, does not stitch out designs very rapidly. So I definitely go faster by hand. Plus all the time savings I mentioned with, you know, lining up repeats and those sorts of things that I do not have to do. So now I'm getting into the darker areas of the quilt, and I expect you're seeing a little bit on the camera, some light variations. We have not figured out a way around that yet. When I move back and forth from light areas into darker areas, we do get those light variations. So I'm not sure if you guys just saw that, but I just had a little wobble in my quilting. I kind of changed my mind midstream, and of course when you're on a non-regulated or constant stitch mode, it keeps on sewing even when you're trying to make up your mind. So there's a little wobble in there, but you know what? My philosophy in general is, if you can't see it from a galloping horse, don't worry about it. So I do these little live kind of real-time episodes about every second week. And I try and do 2 of them 2 days back to back. Both so that it gives you, the viewer, a chance to know that I'm going to be there and come find me. And secondly, so that we only have to do this setup, you know, and it's good for a couple of quilts. So, and also I try to cover a variety of different designs, so you get a chance to see different ones stitched out. So I've gone back into the YouTube uploads of all these episodes and tried to type into them just a very brief title or description of what design I was quilting, so that if you want to see a particular one being done, like the chrysanthemum, or in this case the all over feather, that you can go back at a later date and find it and rewatch it. So hopefully that is helpful. And I would really appreciate actually your feedback today on whether this type of viewing is useful to you. You know, would you prefer to have a scripted and organized class that possibly you have to buy, or is it helpful to just see someone doing it? Can you glean enough from that to make it valuable and useful? So I'd love to know what you think about that. And also, if there are other things you'd like to see, I'd be willing to hear that too. Because as I said, you know, I'm the quilter, my husband is the producer. It's really up to us what type of content we have, how long we do it, all those sorts of things. You may have noticed that I keep the height of my quilting machine higher than most quilters do, and I think you're seeing a good demonstration today of why I do that, because so much of my work is this freehand edge-to-edge type. I do so much of my quilting kind of looking underneath the nose of my long arm, if you will, to see where I'm going, where I've been, and where I need to go next. And I find this height to work the best for me. It's kind of a happy medium between, you know, low enough that I'm not stretching out at arm's length to quilt, and high enough that I don't have to stoop so badly to see and judge where I'm quilting. So mine is definitely rib cage height. So if you have any more questions, now is the moment. I will take all my apparatus off.
Ready?
Yep, I'm ready. What is the best way to learn non-regulated quilting? Just by doing, but certainly start more slowly. Start maybe even at 15% of your machines. Like I think the percentage relates to the maximum speed at which it could go. So start at about 15 and just judge how that feels. If you're still feeling rushed, like it's pushing you around the corner, slow it down even a little bit more. And if you feel like you just can't keep the stitches even, you're kind of pushing out ahead of it, speed it up by 3 or 5 or 7% and just play around with it. I don't know that there's any way to learn but by doing, but I think it's a really important skill.
I'm getting my brownie
Oh,
points.
look. Oh, look, here's my coffee, ladies. Let me just move it away from the quilt. Try not to slurp into the microphone. Okay, let's undo the other end so that we can... Did you see my fancy fix on my stretcher down here? I've got it wound around the pole at the end. Let me just wind this a wee bit, Dave, and then I will come back to where I can see the screen. Okay, I'm ready. Becky, I have signed up for the webinars tomorrow. I work, but Sunday for sure. Set my timer. Fantastic. And you'll receive a couple of reminder emails as well. And all the links and everything are in there. So any one of those emails will give you the link to get to the webinar. So once again, it's at 9 tomorrow, Saturday, 9 Pacific time, and 4 Sunday afternoon, also Pacific time. Sheila, when you sometimes do a curl rather than a feather, can you mention why you might choose that option? You should come to the webinar, Sheila. And I talk all about that option. Yeah, Dave. So this is probably a good time, since Dave is inserting himself here. This is a great time to give a couple of shout outs. So one is clearly to him because he produces this completely. It is far outside of my skill set. So that's one thing. And then the other one is the music that you're hearing is our good friend Dan Unger on the guitar. And thank you to Dan for allowing us to use his music. I just love his guitar playing. So once again, you see that I have advanced my quilt. I have not put my magnetic rungs on the front. My quilt is still so heavy. It's 107 inches long, by the way, so there's about a half a mile hanging down the front of my machine. But I am using the front of my bar. You can really see it well on camera, actually, to line up the seam line that is here, because that is a fantastic gauge for making sure that my quilt is advancing smoothly, that neither side is going faster than the other. Sheila will be there. Good on ya. So I popped my stitch regulator off to do this basting. I'm sure there are quilters that do it with the stitch regulator on, but for me that's a little bit, can get a little wild. It's a little bit wide in one spot here, so I'm just going to pull that excess in toward the center of the quilt, and those feathers will do a great job of pulling it up. Whoops. Dave is chuckling with you, Sheila. Apparently he's reading your icon. He's got it big on his screen and it says, I can't see it myself, but apparently it says, checking Facebook is like your fridge. You know there's nothing good in it, but you check it out every 10 minutes just in case. Just in case something has changed. Well, you know, I hope you're finding today's content to be good, Sheila. I hope that's not part of the nothing good. But no, that is a good one. I completely agree. Okay, basting is in place. My little side rails are just a wee bit tricky to get the fabric fed into. They are loosening up. If you've been here before, you've probably heard me kind of complaining about them. It's a new, what's the word I want, Dave? A new model of these. I've had the red snapper system for a couple of years anyways, but my end clamps wore out, and so I ordered some new ones, and they have this kind of new style, which I did not love to begin with, but I'm growing used to them, and they're loosening up a bit. Okay, Francoise, watching you from Belgium. I love this design. Well, I'm so glad you're here, Francoise. And let me know, because I'm always curious, what time is it in Belgium? Another. Okay. All right, back to the feathers. So I have gone back to the same side of the quilt on which I ended before I did my basting. That is one of the tricks I'll give you today, is that I alternate which side I go from, because the feathers are kind of directional in their stitching, and so right to left and then left to right keeps it moving smoothly. Oh yes, I want my stitch regulator back on, or back off, sorry. So back on constant mode. Here we go. And this is where I had just a little bit of fullness in the quilt. Just a little pressure with my left hand here and there. And those nice round feathers will just pull that all in beautifully. Any kind of round design is very helpful when you've got any amount of excess fabric to pull up. And the thing is, fabric is flexible. So even though this quilt really is well pieced and nice and flat, yet, just with the process of me working on it, you know, it's apt to have a little bit of extra here and a little bit extra there. And if you don't address it right away, all of a sudden you end up with an ugly crease. So whenever I see that little tiny bit of fullness, right away, take care of it. And generally, you can keep it from developing into a horrific problem. And I'm out of bobbin thread.
Full. Francois just says 10 to 11.
10 to 11 in the evening? Oh my, you're a dedicated quilter. I thank you, Francoise, for staying up till late in the evening to watch me quilting. So I'm just undoing a few stitches of my quilting to get back to where I had a corner of a feather, if you will, because that will be the least noticeable place for having a thread splice. And I just drop my seam ripper or my scissors right there because it's on a print, and that way it does not puzzle me when I come back and try to figure out where I left off. So I'm just sailing down to the end where I can reach my bobbin. I think I mentioned earlier that I'm using the same thread top and bottom, and so I don't buy preloaded bobbins, I load them. So when I'm out of camera for a moment, I'm just taking a second to start up my freestanding bobbin winder again. That's how long it takes me, and that will be all wound and ready to go by the next time I come back. And you guys can help me out here. I like to put a drop or two of oil in about every second bobbin, so remind me next time I change, okay? If I forget, poke me, say remember to put a little bit of oil in your bobbin. Here's my seam ripper. X marks the spot. I do not generally tie and bury my threads on edge-to-edge quilting. I just do 4 or 5 little tiny stitches tightly close together, and then I set out. Actually, let's leave it on regulate a moment. I'll do a feather or two and then I'll trim the feather tails. Or sorry, not the feather tails, but the thread tails. And I don't know that you can see that in the camera, and of course it is on a print. But that is not very noticeable at all. So that's my standard way of splicing a thread. It has to be a pretty custom, pretty heirloom sort of project for me to tie and bury all the thread ends, let me tell you. Okay, I'm on constant. I just got to get my head in gear here. Here we go. One of the things that I try to do with my edge-to-edge designs is to actually stitch down any seam allowances that have any amount of bulk. So the ones on this quilt are fairly minor because in most cases they're just two seams crossing each other. There's no, triangles or multiple points or things like that. But even so, if you stitch on both sides of a seam allowance with any bulk at all, just any seam allowance, if you stitch on both sides of it, what will happen is that seam allowance will really stand up after your quilt is released off the tension of the long arm. So, within reason, I don't pull my hair out over it, but within reason, I actually attempt, as I'm guiding my machine around, to tack down those seams. And that just produces a flatter looking quilt. There's one right there. Did you see me just going over that? I saw it coming and I thought I can nail that one right on the head, and so I did. It doesn't work for all of them, but if I have a quilt that does have particularly bulky seam allowances, that's actually part of my thought process in choosing what to quilt on it, is what has enough flexibility that I can really tack down those seam allowances thoroughly. They can be very distracting to the eye if they, if you've got 8 seams crossing at a point and you quilt around them and they stand right up to attention. That can be really distracting on the finished quilt. So there's another one. Quilted right over it. And again, I don't know how much of that is visible as I'm zooming over it, but excuse me one second, I've got a tickle in my throat. Sorry about that, folks. But I felt that coming on for a minute, and I thought I'll just get Dave to mute the mic so I don't deafen you all with a cough. I'm back in business. And my thread has broken, and I don't know why, but because this is real live quilting, I did not hear it snap, but it did in fact break. So again, as I'll do, gosh, hard to keep my tongue straight. As I did when I was splicing the thread, I will just back up a little bit to the last sort of corner of my feather. So I'm just going to trace back over about the last 1/4 inch of quilting there, just to make sure that that is stable. And actually I'm going to reach underneath and see if there's a gnat underneath too. Nope, everything's good. While I'm doing that, I'll mention one of my favorite little tension quickie checks, and that is to reach under as I just did and actually run my fingernail firmly along the bottom thread of the stitches. And if your bobbin tension is at all too tight, you would feel that right away. It would, like a little railroad track under there. Even if it was hardly visible to the eye, you'd feel that with the fingernail. That's my favorite sort of quick check when I'm beginning a quilt, because I can see the top if there's a tension problem, but I can't see the bottom. And that's a quick way to know that your tension is satisfactory underneath. Back onto constant mode. And once again, I'm going to see if I can just advance a couple of inches, enough to do another pass over to the right of my quilt without fully detaching everything. Oh, it looks like I need to detach my one stretcher. Just a little bit too snug. These stretchers are just tricky. They have such a slim wee channel to put the fabric into, and if the fabric is kind of loose at all, you know how that is, it's not a taut straight line. It is so hard to get in there. Bear with me while I figure it out. I've got my pin in hand. Nearly there. Got it. Okay. I just cannot get this to pull tight enough. I'm so close to the edge of my frame here. There must be a better way, but I don't know what it is. See if I can hook my thread on. There we go. I got it. Where there's a will, there's a way. Okay, I think I will base just a little ways more down on here. All right, and back to our constant mode. To just be sure that everything is smooth. Okay, here we go. So when I reach the end of this pass, I'll get Dave to load up a couple of pictures. We've got some photos here of the quilt that I did yesterday. This same sort of live episode, but a very different design to this one. And we brought along a few pictures so you could see. And if you want to see more, I think I posted additional photographs, but at least these, so you could zoom in on them if you want to. They're on all my social media feeds, so Instagram and my Facebook page, Stitched by Susan, if you want to get a close-up look at that quilting design. And it is also already loaded to YouTube, so if that's your preferred platform to watch videos, it's there as well. Also Stitched by Susan. I'm a little boring, aren't I? No fancy names there, but and there again, I went right over a seam. Just helps to tack it down. It makes the whole thing lay more beautifully flat when it's all finished. Something I have occasionally had to deal with when quilting in constant mode is breakage of needles. So there's nothing quite like going at this speed and going over a thick seam and having the needle pretty much explode at you. So you want to avoid that whenever possible. But here's what I would do. If the quilt does have thick seams, for one thing, I would not go at this speed. I would go slower. And for another, I would consider using a heavier duty needle. So I've got 100/16, I believe, loaded in here right now, which is a very medium needle. I occasionally use one size finer and occasionally use one size thicker. So that's kind of, I make that decision based on the thickness of the fabric and layers and seam allowances and all of that sort of thing. And there we are, ready to advance again. So do we have some pictures handy, Dave, of yesterday's quilt?
Yeah, you want to do that or question first?
Either one. You get to choose. Okay. I'll get me a sip of coffee while Dave's loading questions. Bonnie, what kind of machine do you have and what kind of foot are you using? I have a Gamel, and it was an Elevate machine, and it's been upgraded sorry, it was a Vision machine. It's been upgraded to the Elevate, and what that means is I have this little tablet and the ability to do digitized designs. The features that I use all the time are the stitch regulator, which you've seen me have on and off today, and the channel locks, which you've also seen me use. So those are the features I'm attached to. It is a 26-inch throat, which I really like. I seldom utilize the full 26 inches because it's pretty much quilting at arm's length for me. You know, as you can see, that's a long way in there. However, it is awfully nice when you do occasionally work on a quilt that's got custom blocks, for example, and they're large. It gives me the ability to quilt in quite a wide path. And honestly, I think it even helps with my freehand quilting. There's just less advances and passes the more of it that I use. So, another question. Arlene, when I have that issue with my side clamps, I put a small knot in the red stretchy cord to take up some of the slack, then attach my clamps. Once finished, undo the knot, and you're ready for the next one. That's a great idea, Arlene. I will have to take a moment and do that because my one clamp is just too wobbly and loose. So I'm reaching under the quilt now, if you wonder what I'm doing. I could feel that there was just a little rumple of batting under there, and this seems to happen a lot to me, that the sides of the batting stretch a little longer and the middle can pull up by the time I get to the bottom of my quilt. So I always make it a point to at least grasp it in here and make sure everything is tugged. And if I feel any unevenness at all, I will do what I just did, which is flip up the floating quilt top and just give it a gentle little tug under there to keep it from rumpling up. So once again, using my handy seam right here to keep things as straight as possible. And now the bulk of my quilt is hanging. There's not very much resting on the floor. So I'm going to start putting my magnetic bars on the front. So my machine has all metal rails. So I just use these very inexpensive bars from the hardware store along the front to anchor my quilt top. And that just keeps it from pulling up at all when I'm quilting, especially if you're quilting fine or dense designs. That can happen. And one more bar. There we go. Any more questions coming? Or pictures? Yeah, let's go on to pictures. Oh, I'm on this camera. Hello. Okay, so this is the quilt I was working on yesterday, and this is from the back, so you can get a really good look at the little swirls. A very simple design, very round and swirly, obviously, and very forgiving because, as you can see in this photograph, I crossed back over my lines frequently. You can do it as many times as you want to, so it's an easy one for traveling around the quilt top because you can just echo and cross over. And there's a kind of wider apart look, and you can... Sorry, I was going to stitch while it was going, Dave. He doesn't want me to do that, so I'll come back. This is a wider angle view, and so you can kind of see the quilting lines a little better if you want to trace those over a bit. And I'm almost positive I did post this picture on social media, so you can always pull up that picture on your computer monitor and trace the quilting lines if you want to. And here it is from the front of the quilt, so you get an idea of the texture. It's just very soft. I call it coffee bean, probably because I'd been drinking too much coffee the first time I devised this one, but also it's an energetic, happy sort of design. So is that the last picture, I think? So that was all of yesterday's quilt. In retrospect, what a tiny quilt it was compared to this one. Arlene, I know you were on here one of the early days that I had these red snapper clampers, and I was kind of complaining, hopefully not too bitterly, about how difficult they were and the fact that I couldn't close them, hardly even with two hands, never mind with one hand. But the truth is, as I've used them day after day now for a couple of weeks, they have relaxed a good deal and are much easier to use than they were. And actually, I'll leave Lucy there because I will start quilting from the other end. So just getting this last gripper in place. There we go. Tie a handy little knot in my red cord.
Next poll is going to be about
Okay, Dave's here telling me he's doing another poll, and it's going to be about audiobooks and podcasts. What do you listen to? And I do have to pull these down here. I've got a baste. What am I thinking? Sometimes I get so busy talking that I sort of forget what I'm doing. Just grabbing some threads, loose threads. Alrighty, we're all set. Back into our trusty constant mode. One more sip of coffee. Just bear with me a second. So necessary to my well-being. Now that I'm kind of getting into the groove of this, I'm taking a minute as I quilt to notice the incredible variety of blue fabrics that are in these 16 patch squares. They are well randomized, beautifully mixed in. This is actually a great quilt pattern for using up scraps. I would say these squares are 2.5 inches completed, so they would have been 3-inch starting squares. And then the borders, I'm guessing, are 5 inches finished. So they must have been 5.5 to begin with, or the sashing, that's the better word. And then the borders on the perimeter are a little bit wider yet. It's a great way to use up a huge variety of blue fabrics in this particular example. This is definitely the kind of quilt that it would be lovely to have an audible book going in your ear, for sure. Because once you kind of get into the rhythm of it, it doesn't take a whole lot of thinking. And for you, that might not be feathers, that might be a different design. And we're out of bobbin thread again. Woohoo, we're making progress. Yeah. Dave's asking if, well, you guys I'm sure saw it. He's asking me if anybody feels sleepy listening to the drone. This is one wheel you would not want to fall asleep at, let me tell you. So again, I'm just backing up a little bit, to get to a corner because that's a more invisible place to splice my thread, and also because the last few inches of bobbin thread, when you let it run out like that, don't have full tension on them, and so it makes sense to undo a couple of inches and redo them. And I'm just going to take a second. I'm going to borrow my marker and just run a little piece of batting through here. It's getting all linty. And are you guys remembering what I'm supposed to do now? I don't hear anybody reminding me.
Oil.
If I could just get my little piece of batting to run through there. I'm just trying to pull a tiny shred of batting through the, well, not so tiny, but through the hopper foot to clean out some of that lint. Yes, so it's worth taking a moment, even though I'm using low lint thread, it's worth taking a moment to just give a little brush in the bobbin area, because there is still lint. If I had thought of it, I would have looked at the beginning of this quilt how many stitches my machine was at, because it counts stitches. And it would be interesting to know how many it takes to complete a quilt this size. I don't watch my stitch counter all that much, except lately I've had a couple of busy weeks, and a couple weeks that I've said to my husband, I had a 7-figure week this week, meaning I hit 1,000,000 stitches. Don't know if I quite will this week. I'm sitting at 730,268 right now. So every Monday morning I set that again, just because I'm curious. Okay, I left my little scissors marking my spot. It's on the white, so it's not even difficult to see. And again, I'm just going over 3 or 4 stitches that were there and putting in a few tight little stitches to lock stitch that in place. Stitch a couple feathers so I can get at those tails and trim them. And I have a little, you can't really see, there it is, a little curved tip scissors. I find them very helpful in snipping thread close to the fabric without risking cutting the fabric. Okay, stitch regulators back on. Oh, back off. My mistake. Apparently my brain is disengaged a little bit too. But I'm laughing at myself because you know what I did not do? Actually drop oil in the bobbin. So maybe when I get to the end of this pass, I will quickly pull it out and put a droplet of oil in there.
No. And once again, I have a wobble where I changed my mind. But you know, it doesn't have any jerky bits in it. It's a similar size to all my feather shapes, and I am leaving it in. That's part of my determination of how fast to set my stitch regulator is, you know, how fast my thought processes can keep up with where do I go next and what do I do if I have a hesitation. And I've had that little jerky bit happen to me twice already, so I'm realizing, yeah, I'm at the upper limit of how fast I can go because I can't, you know, think on my feet any faster than that. So that's one of my cues. I don't know if they still do this these days, but Dave's father used to tell a story about for qualifying for, I don't know if it was public speaking or exactly what for, but he would practice being able to talk for, I think the number was 2 minutes, Dave, correct me if I'm wildly wrong, without saying or stuttering or having any blank pauses or anything like that. So I'm just thinking, I wonder if they've asked any public speakers to try and do this kind of high-speed stitching while talking. Just thinking, that would be an awesome test of their concentration. And here we are. So I'm going to lock my thread, pull my bobbin out for half a second, and put a drop or two of oil in there while I advance the quilt. Good time for questions or comments. Let me just pull all my bars off, Dave, and then I will come and look at the screen properly. Okay, I'm ready. This camera. Sheila, I'm sometimes surprised at how thread-intensive quilting can be. I do have a tendency to start out larger and go smaller and smaller motifs, though. Yeah, it can happen. It can happen. A few of you who are here today are in my master class, but I'm going to give you all one of the tips that I have in that class, which is, and I'm walking and getting my oil while I do this, but that tip is when you start a design, and this one's a good example of it, at the beginning of a quilt, take a piece of paper or a plexiglass design board or something like that and draw out your quilt at exactly the scale that you're quilting it. You can even start quilting and then trace a little bit. That works as well. And then keep that near to you when you're quilting. So every time you advance, kind of cast a look at that again and make sure that you're keeping within that same scale. So it's an easy way to keep the size of your motifs or feathers or flowers or whatever you're doing constant. Because I think that's true for all of us. It's when it's not right in front of our eyes, it's very difficult to keep it constant. So some go smaller and smaller and tighter. I'm the opposite way. I get bigger and faster as I get toward the bottom of my quilt if I don't pay attention to that. Okay, bobbin is oiled, glasses are on so I can thread the needle. I'm very grateful that long arm needles have big eyes, I tell you. Alrighty, one more clamp to take off. how are we doing for time, Dave? So when I do that little pinch and pull, if you can see that on the camera, I'm grasping the batting as well. I don't know how to describe to you exactly how I do that and not overstretch it, except that I'm familiar with it because I've done it so many times, but I find that I have to keep the batting smooth under there, but of course you don't want to overstretch it either, so it's a fine line there. So we're at 2:40 something, so we've been going about an hour and 40 minutes, is that correct? Okay, so making decisions on the fly here again. I'm going to keep quilting. You guys are welcome to stay as long as you would like. I do have another live session later this afternoon with the folks that are in my master class, and I need to do a little prep for that. So for sure by 3:30 my time, so 3:30 Pacific time, so that's 50 minutes from now. We'll be winding up by then. So just so you guys know and have a gauge for time, so if you want to plan your afternoon in any way. And you know, if you're getting weary of watching this particular paint dry, be my guest and do other things. But I just feel like this is kind of fun to maybe have on in the background when you're perhaps sewing in your sewing room, and there might be a little nugget here or there that can be helpful to you in your daily quilting, I hope. You have heard me refer a couple times now this afternoon to my masterclass, which is basically just an intensive 6-module class all about freehand quilting and generally edge-to-edge quilting. So some of the ladies that are watching today have been in that masterclass, and we've been running, you know, various live sessions with Q&As and things like that over the 6-week period of the class. But if by any chance you're interested in it, feel free to visit my website. I'm sure Dave will throw a link up there for you. There's a syllabus there which gives you all the lesson plans and what's included in it, all that sort of stuff. And of course, if you're coming to the webinar tomorrow, at the end of that webinar, I'll be giving more details too about the class if you want them. So I don't want to belabor it today, but if you've heard me refer to it and wonder what I'm talking about, that's what it is. I am starting on that side, on the left-hand side. Another little sip here of the elixir of life. Oh yes, got to put my stretcher on. It's funny, you don't realize how, you know, kind of much a creature of habit you are until you start talking and forgetting to do the habitual things. It's terrible. And by the way, Arlene, I tried the little knot in the red cord and it's working fabulously. So see, that's one reason for getting together to quilt like this. That's the beauty of quilting together, is you learn these little tips from each other that you might not have figured out on your own. I'm not really a MacGyver. Clearly Arlene is. Okay, what am I looking at, Becky? I'm watching, listening, and unpicking a row I sewed wrong. Ugh! I'm so sorry. But I'm glad you're here. And Sheila, I'm going to load a quilt. I've been doodling feathers along with you, and I'm going to do some real quilting of this design. Fantastic! Send me pictures. Tag me. I would love to know how that goes for you. Okay. Yeah, we're almost exactly at the halfway point, so it's probably not going to get finished this afternoon. But... and constant mode. If you quilters follow me on social media, you probably see from time to time I post pictures of my black cat. I call him the quilt police because he's always hanging over the edges of my quilts, you know, making sure they're up to snuff. Anyway, you can't see it, I know, but he's currently walking around my feet, just checking on things. So I mentioned that I try and do these live episodes about every second week. So next week there probably will not be any, but the following week I am currently planning, plans are somewhat subject to change, but I'm currently planning to actually do a custom quilting project. So it will be several days of working on the same project and just, you know, in sections, either areas or type of quilting or whatever. So if that interests you, you know, there may be a little more intricate quilting, possibly some ruler work and that sort of thing involved in that one. Maybe kind of mark that down on your calendar. I will post about it as well. But if you want to know when these episodes happen, the very best way would be to join my newsletter, which can be done very easily from my website, stitchedbysusan.com. And then I'll notify, you know, a day or two in advance of whenever I've got live episodes coming up. The quilt that I'm planning to work on, some of you may be familiar with it. So it's by Crabapple Hill, which is Meg Hockey. And it's lots of hand embroidered blocks. And this particular quilt is sundress. So it has these absolutely darling embroidered sundresses. I keep threatening to make some of them into actual dresses. They're just so darn cute. Anyway, that's my current plan. So 2 weeks hence, I hope to load that embroidered quilt and quilt it over the course of however many sessions it takes, but probably a minimum of 3. And there, as you can see, I squeezed some smaller feathers in. It just happens from time to time, no matter how hard you try to gauge your spacing as you go. Occasionally, you've got a narrow channel to squeeze through or a wider space that just needs filling. So I just try to make my adjustment not too abrupt. So if I've got to make a smaller petal, I make a couple of smaller petals so it kind of looks on purpose. And other than that, I just go with the flow. When you think about the sheer number of individual feather plumes that are on this quilt, you know, 10 or 15 that are a bit funky shaped are not much in the scheme of things. But I do think that's actually a good design principle for freehand quilting, is when you have to do something a little bit out of the ordinary, just do it more than once so it looks on purpose and part of the plan. And let's see if we can do our mini advance here. Gotta take my magnets off before I do that. Possibly I can just scoot them down. I think so. My kitty, by the way, is laying just left of my walking area here, about 12 inches. He's just laying there minding his own business, more or less. Making sure I stay on the straight and narrow. Okay, there is our quilting space. I think that's plenty of room to do another pass of feathers. One more pass and then we'll see where we're at for time at that point. You know what? I'm going to pause a sec. Roll my shoulders a little bit, and also, excuse me, my tongue is tangled. Have people comment regarding podcasts or audible listening? You can tell I'm getting tired. My tongue is kind of, whew. Here's our poll. Favorite genre of audiobook/podcast: mystery 29%, romance 43%, true crime 29%, pop fiction. Well, good for you guys leaving off the pop fiction. That's not quite right. There are current books that I love too. I would love to know if you have any specific authors or podcasts to recommend, but I'm going to recommend one to you that I recently found. I have both listened to a couple of her books and read a couple, like as an ebook style, and that is there's the camera I'm in, Catherine Ray, and the Ray is spelled R-E-A-Y. An excellent author. It is fiction, it is Christian fiction, but it's just so well done. So she obviously has a thing about the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen, and so there's a lot of literary references and quotes and those sorts of things, and I love those books too, so that makes it all very interesting. So she's an excellent author that I can highly recommend. Anything else I need to change, Dave, or no, or just keep going? Okay, we're in business. I'm not sure how well it translates onto camera, because I know you have one camera that's looking very closely at my stitching, and then on the further one I don't know that you can see the actual stitching, but my basic traveling path is like a giant meander. So I am basically doing that kind of end of a dog bone sort of shape, back and forth and back and forth, and thinking of that as though that were my invisible spine and laying my feathers on it. So that's my basic pattern of movement around the quilt. So I certainly try to have very few straight lines. In other words, one plume left, one plume right, one plume left, one plume right. So there's two left, one right, or vice versa. So that keeps that implied spine always curving. And that is one of the things, one of you was asking earlier, you know, how I learned to progress into this type of feather, or how that kind of came to be. And I was saying my feathers have very much evolved, my edge-to-edge feathers, throughout the quilts. And that's one of the things that I learned to do that I thought makes a more pleasing feather, is to not have any that are traveling in a sort of straight path. They're always curving this way and that. There I alternated a few, and I don't love that look as much. But again, I'm thinking of how many feathers there are across the top of this quilt. A few that don't please my eye 100% is quite okay with me. And there's always progress. It's funny, every year when you look back at your quilting from last year, you think, oh man, I've learned to do that so much better. I still find that to be true. I totally do. So I don't think you ever arrive as a quilter. You keep thinking of new ways to improve or shape a design or motif. It's always evolving. Perhaps across this wide white area you can kind of get a feel for the basic meander shape that I was talking about. I just don't know if it's visible from our various camera angles, but as always I will post some pictures after we're finished, and I will endeavor to have some that give a good glimpse of that understood spine. We're out of bobbin thread, by the way, if you wondered what I'm doing. So once again, backing up just a little bit wherever I can see that the tension was a few stitches loose. I want to take those out. Leave my little marker on the quilt. The other thing I'm going to do while I'm paused is change out my needle. I'm hearing it just a little bit kind of popping, which is a signal to me that it's dull. So first off, we'll pop a new bobbin in the bobbin case. And we'll quickly change out the needle. I do get asked from time to time how often I change my needle. I know some long armers just recommend change your needle with every quilt, but to me that's a little too oversimplified. It depends on the size of the quilt. It depends on the density of quilting. I mean, some stitches can easily have 5 or 6 times as much quilting as another, and so I'm having a terrible time getting my needle in. There we go. So it depends on many of those factors. So I tend to just do it whenever, if I'm having any trouble with my, stitch formation or tension, that's kind of the first place I look is the needle. But certainly if I hear, as I was doing today, just that gentle little popping with every stitch, I know that's a sign of a dull needle. Another thing that dulls them quickly could be, what types of fabrics you're working on. Batiks are notorious for that. T-shirt quilts, those sorts of things. So there are really a lot of factors that go into choosing. And I occasionally do adjust my needle, its turn, right or left, just a hair. So I'm going to just stitch a little bit within my basting edge of my quilt, just to run a line of stitching and just be sure that it's got a good tension going on. And we'll put it on to regulate for that so it doesn't race away on me. Looks good on top. Once again, I'll do my fingernail test on the bottom. How's that feeling? Feels good. And all my tails on the edge, I don't worry about too much. Unless they request not, I always offer to trim up quilts for my clients. So I take them, I've got a table in a side room here, and I take them in there with a long straight edge ruler and a rotary cutter, and I trim the edges down to 1/4 inch so they're ready for binding. So I don't worry about my thread tails on the edges as I'm quilting, because they all get taken care of in that trim up. Okay, let's put 1 or 2 in and then cut our tails. And honestly, that did not change the popping at all, so I'm going to say it's just the fabric. But I know that was a fresh needle, so I know it's not the fault of my needle, so now I'm not going to worry about it anymore. one more in there. There we go. Ready to advance. Have we got time for one more pass, Dave? Mr. Producer, sir?
We are 2 hours and 19 minutes.
So we're at 3:20. Is that correct? Okay. All right, just had a little powwow with my producer guy on the side. I was thinking in my mind that my Q&A session with my students was at 4, but it's actually at 5 my time, so we have time to do another pass easily. No comments from you guys? No questions? Must mean you know it all. Just to put things in perspective, there were 7 rows of blocks, 7 rows this way. So this is row number 5 right here. So we've made good progress, I feel like. Someone was asking yesterday after the episode was over, so I'll answer it here. She was saying that other long armors had suggested to her that it's better to clamp and stretch your backing first and then stitch the top of your quilt onto it, and she was asking why I do it the other way around. So this is just my thinking. For one thing, I'm not an always or never sort of quilter, but I'll just give you the reasons for why I do it the way I do it, and then you can decide if that's appropriate for you. But for me, I feel like if I stretch the back nice and taut with my stretchers and then lay my batting and my quilt top, that my back is going to have more tension on it. It's going to be more stretched out. So I prefer to baste all the layers together and then put tension on the sides, equal tension on all layers, if that makes sense. So that's my personal reasoning. I'm just having a heck of a time getting my fabric into the stretcher. Gracious sakes. Needle and everything, I'm just not managing it. Or pin, not needle. Almost. I got it. Okay. So that's one side done. I'm going to be beginning on the left to stitch again. So there are a number of ways that you can go to greater lengths to square up a quilt when you're loading it. So whether it's really carefully squaring the back before you load it, or whether it's having a tape measure stretched across it to know exactly where the sides are as you're progressing, whether it's having a mark on your leaders and lining things up with that, all of those things work well. For me and for this quilt, I have decided that this is satisfactory. Like, I loaded the back on straight, and so I'm just keeping my quilt well centered, and I'm basting a straight line down the edge. I'm giving up on that stretcher, by the way. Let's just put a clamp on it. Train of thought. Where was I? Okay, this is terrible. Officially terrible. But we were talking about keeping the quilt straight. For one thing, this is a very casual quilt. So if it's a 1/4 inch out on a 107-inch quilt, I'm not going to panic. So that's one thing. And for another, largely it's just experience. I've done lots of quilts and I have a pretty good eye for keeping them straight, for not stretching and distorting the fabric, that sort of thing. But If you need to take a little extra precautions, by all means do. If you want to pin your sides before you baste them to keep everything straight, by all means do. You don't have to take the shortcuts. You don't have to do it the way that I do. It's just one way. Something I'm seeing today that I find really fascinating is certain fabrics will change how your stitches look on the surface. So when I'm quilting on the white background fabric, my stitches look perfect. But certain of these blue squares, it looks like my top tension is far too loose. And so far, well, maybe not far too loose, but I can see it. It looks a little straighter as it does when it's a bit loose instead of seeing the individual stitches. But so far I have not adjusted the tension because on most of the fabrics it looks just right. So that just seems to be a phenomenon of certain fabrics. And if there's a cure for it, I don't know it. Pause for a second. I am going to loosen my top tension just a touch. And my husband brought me hot coffee. I'm telling you, every one of you needs a producer like I have. And a little sip of that in. Delicious. It's looking good, ladies. But I've never met a feather that I didn't like, so it doesn't really come as a huge shock. but I love this on a quilt. That's a little better in my tension, so it still looks good on the white, and it's a little bit better stitch formation on the blues. Things like that often do change a little bit when you change the needle, and I don't know why that is. But as you saw when I changed it, it's often a good idea to just take a moment to do a quick tension check, because it's very common for it not to behave exactly the same way when you put a new needle in. Or at least I find that to be true of my machine. Honestly can't remember if I've asked this or not, but do you guys have any great recommendations for some Audible books? I remember giving you mine, but it's all a blur now. I do love a good Audible book when I'm quilting something like this. Well, really any time, but especially when I'm quilting something like this. A good gripping book. I recently listened to a couple of the James Herriot books again, and those of you that are my age-ish will probably remember them. He was a veterinary surgeon in northern England, and he wrote some awesome kind of autobiographical books, I think loosely at least, based on his life. But humorous, engaging, lots of sweet stories about animals. And of course, the accent of the reader is just fantastic to listen to, too. Thoroughly have enjoyed those. Awesome. One of the great features about Lucy is she stops on a dime. I don't know if you guys can see that when I'm in that constant mode. That is a very nice feature when you are quilting with rulers. To have a machine that stops immediately when you ask it of her. We have some questions apparently, and or comments. Let me get my coffee while Dave gets the camera lined up. I won't lean over the quilt with it, I promise. Bev, I have been trying to practice this pattern. You make it look easy. You may have covered this, but how do you keep them uniform? Very best way, honestly, Bev, is to come to the webinar tomorrow if you have time for it, or Sunday afternoon, because I break it right down into the individual feather plumes, why I shape them the way I do, what I used to shape them like, and why that has evolved. And if you've been listening for a while today, you've gathered I'm an explainer, like really since kindergarten, show and tell. I'm an explainer. So I'll tell you, why I do things the way I do, and that may change and evolve in the future. But yeah, best way is to come to the webinar. Dave, I'm pretty sure I know what Susan will say. Tune into the webinar tomorrow and Sunday. I mean, it really is the best way. I do actually draw them out on paper for you and then quilt them. Do I draw them in the webinar, Dave, in my demo? No, my bonus sheets that come to you are of them drawn on paper so that you can watch them. But I quilt them out piece by piece, and it's white thread on black fabric so that you can really see in detail what I'm quilting. So the individual plumes are there, how I make them turn corners, how I fit them into awkward spaces, how I move across the quilt top. All of that is part of that discussion in the webinar. That answer, was that a little overkill? Sheila, I'm wondering if when using the red snappers, can you take the quilt off half done and then put it back on easily and still lined up? Yes. This may be just my machine, but I have zippered leaders on, so my canvas leaders in which the red snapper rods go, I can zip that whole leader off, complete with the little red snapper rod. And so that's what I'll do, because Sheila, you're one of the people that's going to be here for the live Q&A. And you'll see me with a totally different setup on my quilting machine in fairly short order, and that's how I'll do it. I will literally zip this quilt off and zip another set of leaders on. And then when I want to come back to this quilt, I can zip it back on and it will be nice and straight. Yep. Is that it for questions? Okay. Another sip of my piping hot coffee.
2 hours and 20 minutes.
I think I am going to do another row just because the more I get done, the less loose fabric I have floating about when I take it off. There's time for me. If you guys need to take a break or do other things, by all means do it. Meantime, we'll just let the cameras keep running and keep on progressing. We are making headway. This is blue row number 6 of 7. So the end is in sight. Once again, putting a little tug on that batting till I'm sure that it's smooth in under there. I think that'll do it. So this is quite a large and fluffy quilt, so I have had to raise my roller, my back take-up roller, a couple times. You probably can't see that on camera, but that is something that I adjust as I quilt, and particularly with the red snappers, because you have that kind of chunky apparatus where it's clipped on, and it makes a bit of a bulge in the quilt depending on where that is. Like if it is directly downwards, I often have to roll that take-up roller up a little ways and then back down after I've passed the red snapper, if that makes sense. I keep my quilt not too far above the actual bed of my quilting machine. I find if I have it more than, 3/4 of an inch or so above the bed of my machine, that I get such vibration when I'm stitching. So I prefer to have it pretty close and just adjust it as needed. Let's see if we can get the red snapper on this end. Apparently not. I'm not going to waste too much time doing that. I do have a fair bit of excess backing on this quilt, which is nice. So I'm able to just attach my clamps. And I just put very gentle tension on it so that I don't get a scalloped sort of edge. And put our magnets all back on. If you're trying these magnets for the first time, it can be helpful to, they have, or at least mine do, they have holes drilled in the end, and it's very possible to put drawer pulls on there for grasping them. I found that mine would not stay screwed on tight, plus I needed so many. So they are also, I don't know that you can see this on the camera, but they're hollow in underneath here. This one, ha! Dave's so clever. There, can we see? They're hollow at this end. So I just pick them up by sliding my finger under there and releasing the magnet. What you don't want to do, and ask me how I know this, is leave them laying about on the floor where you could inadvertently kick one. And again, I'm just gently attaching my clips at this end. Alrighty. I feel like I'm pulling on a cord, Dave. I am, just a little bit right there. Did you see it? Bear with us a sec while we get a cord that has sort of sagged into the way. There we go. It always amazes me how little of a thing you can feel with your long arm. Like a little piece of lint in the roller tracks, that's what I'm trying to say. It doesn't take much, and you can feel that little bitty bit of resistance. Those of you who have stuck it out for this whole show, I feel like I ought to give you a star on your chart. This has been a marathon. But I did still want to deliver the feathers because that was what I promised, so I opted to dive in even with the big quilt. And there are different things about that that are just different than handling small quilts, so I think it's beneficial to see that too. What floating a big quilt looks like, for example. The total measurements on this one, by the way, are 90 by 107. So honestly, if I just get 3/4 of the way done, which I'm going to do, that's a good afternoon's work, I'd say. I went a little too far downwards with that meander. I'm having a hard time making my way all the way up to the top. But I feel like as long as I keep curving back and forth, it'll be okay. There still will be no straight line of feathers to catch your eye. And I'll just make my next one a wee bit shorter. Has anybody been counting bobbins, by the way? Just curious. I think I have number 4 in the machine, but I'm not 100% sure. So if any of you knows for sure, let me know. This is going to be the last pass for today, so if you have any last minute questions, now's your chance. I know I've already done it, but I'll do it again, inviting you all to the webinar tomorrow. So it's about this same design, but because I'm not on a person's actual quilt, you know, I'm on a sample, I take the time to quilt out all the parts, broken down into their simplest pieces, and then, you know, put them back together into the all over feather format for you. I show a picture of some of the first quilts I ever did with the all over feather and how my quilting out of these feathers has changed over time, and even why, because that might help you think through the process and make changes of your own to make them suit your style or taste. So that is tomorrow morning at 9, and then I'm kind of letting the cat out of the bag, but whatever. Those of you who stay to the end, I will send out some practice sheets that have kind of traceable, the same feather motifs from the very simplest and on up, so that you can kind of put them in a page protector and go over them and practice them at your leisure and get a feel for this. I know that it looks out of reach when you see me just smoothly sailing around a quilt like this, but it's really not. So my purpose with the webinar is to break that down as much as I can into the smallest possible components so that you can practice step by step and get to this point as well. Feathers are, I think, my all-time favorite thing to quilt. It kind of amazes me how contemporary they can look. I mean, the feather as a quilting motif is a very traditional design, but of course with the advent of machine quilting, it has changed and evolved and has almost as many different looks as there are quilters producing it, you know? It's so personalizable. But it's amazing to me how such a traditional design can still look contemporary and modern when tweaked a little bit or when applied to a quilt that is contemporary. So I love that quilting can be so flexible like that. I'm pausing for a second because I'm reaching the limit of my cord. I can feel it. So we're just adjusting that. But I am at the edge of my quilt. So I think we're going to call a halt there for today. So I will let Dave load any questions or comments. If there are any, I would love to hear them. And as always, you know, let me know. You can comment on this afterwards if you've watched a replay or whatever. There we are. Now I'm in the camera. Let me get my coffee off of the quilt. You're welcome to make comments later on if you're watching the replay of this. If you have questions, you can ask them and I'll come back and answer them. But if you have comments too, like I really do want to know, is this type of thing helpful? Is it just like running a marathon? That sort of thing. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you want to see particular designs in the future or styles of quilt, and I'll do my best to accommodate. So we will be... Oh, comment from Sheila. Let's look at that for a sec. I have to take my glasses off in order to read things on the screen. I'm envious of your loading process now. Trying to put on the worst cut 108-inch backing quickly. I have recently gone to zippers, not realizing they still have to be pinned. No hand strength, so put red snappers out of the options. It's hard to read against the white for me. After watching your quick method, I'm just jealous. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Sheila, because that is certainly when the snappers come into their own, is in that loading process. But you might try, Sheila, doing a similar thing in that you pin on the front bar as I've done, drape the whole thing over the back bar of your quilting machine and pull it on, pulling it on straight. So if you've got all the wrinkles smoothed out, that should still wind up straight. You'll still need to do the pinning at the end. You might need to make adjustments, like you can't push the red snappers obviously against the rail, which you now can't see me touching, but you could have, depending on the frame you're using, you could have the leader laying on your table at the back, smooth your fabric across that and pin. I've seen other ladies do that, so that might be an option. I know 108-inch wide backings can be brutal, inches and inches out of square, so that might be an option. Melody, I love watching you quilt. I've only done digital E2E so far. I need to try free motion soon. You bet you do. But I'm all about freehand quilting, so of course I'm going to say that. It is so freeing. There's so many good things about it. Top of the line is, it's just so freeing. Well, thank you ladies for watching. I hope that I will see some of you in the webinar tomorrow or on Sunday. And as I mentioned, next week I won't have any live episodes, but the following week I am currently planning to do a custom quilt. So it will be loaded and done over the course of several days. So that should be a fun time. So I hope you'll join me then. It'll be right here on my Facebook page also. And that's where you can find me. So thanks for joining us today and see you next time.